discussing the topic of North Carolina and the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, these campfire programs that we offer every night during the summertime give all of the park rangers a special opportunity. We're pretty much allowed to pick whatever we want to talk about. Can you guys imagine why I would select North Carolina as the topic? That's exactly right. I'm from North Carolina. So I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was educated in Chapel Hill. Any Duke fans out here? Awesome. No, one in the back. Well, we'll have to deal with it. So I was educated at Chapel Hill, but I consider myself somewhat of a Pennsylvanian today. I've been welcomed pretty well up here. I hope you guys will have me just the same here this evening. Does anybody here know Latin very well? Anybody study Latin? Can you do a translation for the program title?
To be rather than to sing.
That's exactly right. So the program title tonight is Esse, Quam, Videri, which is actually the North Carolina state motto, which means to be rather than to seem. And that is going to be what we talk about tonight. Tonight we're talking about the notion of identity. Everyone here has an identity of some type. Whether or not you identify yourself as a park ranger like myself, or as a student, or a parent, or a grandparent, everyone has an identity. And identity is the topic that we're going to talk about tonight. Specifically, we're going to look at how North Carolina developed an identity as the Civil War went on and on, specifically here at Gettysburg. Before we begin, though, I have a question for you guys. What do you guys think when I say North Carolina? What are some things that come to mind? The Tar Heel State, that's exactly right.
Furniture manufacturing.
Furniture manufacturing, that's a really good one. Western North Carolina has tons of furniture made there. IVerson, so we've got an officer in the Confederate Army. We're going to talk about him some tonight. What else?
Basketball.
Basketball, that's exactly right. 2009 National Championships, that's us. That was my freshman year. What else?
Barbecue.
Barbecue. Anything else?
Great Smoky Mountains.
The Great Smoky Mountains. You guys have hit on it, a lot of those things, but I'm going to show you a couple slides for some things that you guys might not have hit on. We've got tobacco plants on the left, some cotton plants here on the right. Those are two big agricultural products that are still produced there in North Carolina. Down here at the bottom we have
Donut plants.
donuts, and that's exactly right. Krispy Kreme, that's headquartered in North Carolina. What about this stuff? NASCAR. NASCAR is huge in North Carolina. All of these things are part of North Carolina's identity. Here's another slide with some that you might not know a whole lot about when it's connection to North Carolina. Banking. Bank of America is headquartered in my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. Why would banks want to headquarter in Charlotte? There's history tied here.
The coast
So-
for importing and exporting.
So importing, exporting the money, that's a good part of it.
It's the first gold rush.
It's the first gold rush, that's exactly right. There was a gold rush in North Carolina that began in the 1820s. There was actually more gold pulled out of North Carolina than California. It just took place over a longer period of time, so there wasn't a huge rush like what California got. And the banking's actually going to play into a later part of this program. Let's step back in time now, though, a little more than 150 years ago. How did most Americans see North Carolina? They called North Carolina the Rip Van Winkle State. The Rip Van Winkle. Who knows the story of Rip Van Winkle? What is it? What happens to Rip Van Winkle? What is he?
Went to sleep and basically slept for 20 years.
He took a really long nap, exactly. And he woke up, he had this huge long gray beard, and he was way behind the times. He didn't understand how the world worked because he'd been asleep for 20 years. That's how a lot of people looked at the state of North Carolina. They called North Carolina the Rip Van Winkle State. It had a miserable transportation system, had a horrible system of education before the Civil War. Illiteracy ran throughout the state all the way from the mountains to the coastline. It was known as the Rip Van Winkle State. But North Carolina is going to assume a little bit of a different identity as the Civil War goes on. We're going to be looking at the idea of North Carolina assuming the identity of sacrifice. Part of that identity comes from the fact that in 1860, the census showed that there were 115,000 military-aged white males in the state of North Carolina. By the end of the war, the state had enlisted 125,000 men. Might be asking where the other 10,000 come from. Well, obviously that means that men that were younger than the military age were volunteering, and men that were older than the military age were volunteering as well. The state also has a very interesting history when it comes to how they seceded. They're actually the last of all of the Confederate states to secede from the Union. They do not secede until Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion that's already taking place in states like South Carolina and Virginia. North Carolina decided that they didn't want to send men to the army to put down the rebellions in South Carolina and Virginia. They probably also realized at this point they're surrounded by Confederate states, so they decided to secede on May 20th of 1861. Shortly after seceding, those thousands of volunteers begin to join the ranks of the Confederate regiments that are going to be joining the Confederate Army. I've got a couple slides here showing you some of those early volunteers from the state of North Carolina. This one is here just for your amusement. Check out the haircuts on these guys. They thought they looked pretty fierce when they marched off to war. So they fight throughout 1861 and 1862. They're present at most of the battles. They're known to fight fairly hard in those places. But marching here to Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee is bringing a 75,000 man army. 14,000 of those soldiers are from the state of North Carolina. There are going to be more North Carolinians here than from any other state. North Carolina has the most concentration of soldiers on the Gettysburg battlefield. These men are going to be part of the infantry brigades that you might have heard of Pettigrew and Davis and Scales, Lane, Iverson, Ramseur, Daniel, and Avery. You can see their tablets all over the battlefield, the brigade tablets. And if you see any of those have North Carolina troops in those units. There's also 4 batteries of artillery and 4 entire regiments of cavalry from North Carolina in the Confederate Army at Gettysburg. We're going to look at the Battle of Gettysburg and North Carolina's participation in a couple of different ways. We're going to look at it from the perspective of the individual soldier. We're going to look at it as an entire unit, so we're going to be picking out a unit and looking at how they fight on the battlefield. We got a chorus coming from the farm as well. And then we're going to look at an officer from North Carolina as well. So we got these 3 entities, the soldiers, the units or the brigades, and then the officers. And we're going to follow the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg in those ways. July 1st, 1863, the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee is going to commit 25,000 men to battle. Out of those 25,000 men, 10,000 of them were the North Carolinians that he has brought with him here to Gettysburg. These are going to be the brigades of Pettigrew, Scales, Lane, Iverson, Daniel, and Ramseur. So to look at the fighting here on July 1st, 1863, when it comes to North Carolina soldiers, we're going to look at 2 men. One's name is William O'Daniel, and the other one's name is Leonidas Torrance. They're from Gaston County, North Carolina, which is just west of my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. They both enlisted in the Army together in 1862, and they became very, very close friends, William O'Daniel and Leonidas Torrance. Now, unfortunately, the only trace we have of these 2 men is this letter here, a series of letters that actually look like this. Now, for you guys don't have to understand hieroglyphics. I've already transcribed the letter, so I'm going to read some of it to you here as we go. These 2 men are in a unit called the 23rd North Carolina Infantry Regiment, and they're a part of a brigade under this guy, Alfred IVerson. Alfred IVerson was not from the state of North Carolina. Their commanding officer, Alfred IVerson, he's actually from Georgia. And you might be wondering how a Georgian came to control about 1,400 North Carolina soldiers making up his brigade. Well, they were wondering the same exact thing. The relationship between the North Carolinians and Alfred IVerson was not very good. First of all, they didn't like the fact that he was from Georgia. Secondly, he was in the United States Army before the Civil War began. A lot of officers for the Confederacy were. Well, he was stationed at one point in his career with the United States Army at Carlisle Barracks, just north of the town of Gettysburg. And when the 23rd North Carolina, William O'Daniel and Leonidas Torrance, when they go marching into Carlisle before the Battle of Gettysburg, what does Alfred IVerson do? He goes and finds his friends, and he has dinner with them in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And his men become very suspicious of what he's doing. Here they are in Pennsylvania. They've invaded the North. Why is their commanding officer having dinner with the Pennsylvania locals? This is going to add to the tension between Alfred IVerson and his men, the tension is only going to increase as they arrive here on July 1st of 1863. So IVerson is going to arrive at an area called Oak Hill. It's marked today by the Eternal Peace Light Memorial, which is on the auto tour. You may or may not have seen it. If you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to go and see that monument, as well as the terrain of Oak Hill. IVerson arrives here on Oak Hill with his brigade of 1,400 men, including these guys, William O'Daniel and Leonidas Torrance. And IVerson is going to stop in place and allow his men to go into combat. And IVerson is going to stay back in the safety of the rear. And IVerson's men are going to look over their shoulder and they're going to realize that they're going in without their leader. He has decided to stay out of the fight and direct the fighting from afar. That's all well and good except for what happens to his men. IVerson's men enter this field right here. You've got the peace light over here. So on July 1st, you've been able to see William O'Daniel and Leonidas Torrance headed straight towards you. The thing that these men don't understand, the Confederates don't realize, is that behind a stone wall, which is just out of view to the right of the picture here, there were over 1,000 Union soldiers waiting for them. And the Union soldiers allow them to get within 50 yards of their position before they spring up over the wall and fire their rifles into William O'Daniel and Leonidas Torrance and the rest of the North Carolinians that are marching through this field. In that one moment, we believe about 700 North Carolinians were killed or wounded instantly with that one volley. In that fighting, Leonidas Torrance is actually wounded. And William O'Daniel would write a letter back home to Leonidas' mother after the battle, and he said that Leonidas and I went into battle side by side. We promised each other, if one got hurt, to do all we could for him. O'Daniel would continue to describe the fighting here on July 1st by saying that Leonidas was shot between the eye and the ear. He was actually shot right here in the temple. I think the ball that went in his head went near his brain. He did not know anything for several hours. Leonidas was actually shot a second time in that instant. One of them hit him in his thigh, and William O'Daniel actually thinks that the bullet ricocheted off his bone and traveled up into his body cavity. He said that Leonidas didn't know anything for several hours. When he came to his senses, he could not eat anything. He drank a great deal of water, but throwed it all up. And listen to this. Then O'Daniel thinks it's a great idea. He says, I got him some milk, but it would not lie on his stomach. Imagine the heat of July 1st, 1863. You're shot twice and your friend brings you milk. Nevertheless, he said that he could not keep the milk on his stomach. Eventually, O'Daniel has to move on. He has to leave his friend Leonidas behind. O'Daniel wrote in this moment, he says, when I went to tell him goodbye, he told me that I would never see him again. He said he was going to die. He also said that he was willing to die. You do not have any idea how bad that I hated to leave Leonidas. I asked the doctor to let me stay with him, but he would not. Leonidas gave me his testament, his pocket knife, and pocketbook to me, and told me if he died to give them to you. So you can see through the words of Leonidas Torrance, these North Carolinians that arrived here at Gettysburg, some of them believe that they are here and they're willing to die for their country. And this is the notion of sacrifice that North Carolina is beginning to assume as the Battle of Gettysburg continues for 2 more days. Now on July 2nd of 1863, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, there weren't very many North Carolina soldiers engaged in the battle. What happened on July 2nd? This is very, very famous stuff. If you toured the battlefield, you probably know. Where'd the fighting happen? Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, so that's actually the obscure stuff that we'll be talking about. Where else?
Little Round Top.
Little Round Top, that's probably the more famous of the fighting. Little Round Top and Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, and the Wheat Field. There weren't any North Carolinians that fought in that part of the battle. But there were North Carolinians that assaulted East Cemetery Hill. If you go out to East Cemetery Hill, that's where we have the monument to Winfield Scott Hancock and Oliver Otis Howard. The cemetery gatehouse is there. If you're in that area, this is where all this stuff took place that I'm going to talk about next. The North Carolinians that we're talking about are a brigade led by this guy. This is Isaac Avery. Isaac Avery, before the war, was a student at UNC Chapel Hill. He's a Tar Heel just like I am. And he actually worked for the railroad for a short period of time. When the war began, he became a colonel in the North Carolina Infantry. He commanded the 6th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. But here at Gettysburg, he's going to be promoted above the regimental level, and he's going